article by Lawson Akyobe called The Arithmetic of Governance. We're going to explore a pretty simple, but honestly often ignored premise that no matter how powerful or persuasive a government might be, it is ultimately bound by the unbreakable, unyielding laws of math.
So let's just jump right into the central mystery here, the paradox that sets up everything we're looking at today. Can a government actually shrink its revenue, but still keep all its promises? I mean, it sounds kind of like a riddle, right? But as Akihinbe's analysis points out, this is exactly what modern political discourse constantly claims is totally possible. So today, we're going to use the author's work to test the actual math behind that exact claim.
All right, Section 1, the foundational contract.
To really get the math, we first got to define our baseline. Government isn't just some abstract machine floating above us. It's a collective expression built on a very fundamental contract. The state draws resources from us, its citizens, primarily through taxes, and then redistributes them back into society as public goods and security. And just like any contract, it has some pretty strict constraints.
This right here brilliantly illustrates the basic arithmetic of that contract. Think of it like a giant ledger. On the input side, you've got taxation, state assets, and service fees. On the output side, you're looking at infrastructure, healthcare, education, and national security. Akibe really grounds us in reality here. The inputs literally have to fund the outputs. If that left side shrinks, the right side is inevitably going to take a hit. You simply can't fund robust healthcare or national security if the taxation and fees that pay for them are slashed, unless you magically find a way to balance that ledger somewhere else. Moving on to Section 2, the 1980s ideological shift.
Historically speaking, this perfectly balanced equation got challenged by a massive ideological shift. According to the source, starting back in the 1980s, leaders like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK rolled out doctrines that specifically sought to shrink the size and scope of the state. Their main argument was that markets, rather than governments, allocate resources way more efficiently. This idea really took off and led to sustained tax reductions and regulatory easing all through the 2000s, carrying right through to the 2020s, where we're now looking at the long-term results 4 decades later.
Central to this whole worldview was one very specific economic promise. The theory went like this. If the most economically productive individuals and corporations were allowed to accumulate wealth with minimal state interference or taxation, that resulting prosperity would naturally trickle down to the broader population. Basically, by letting the top thrive, the idea was that everybody else would eventually benefit.
Which brings us to Section 3, 4 decades later.
Now, when impartially grading the results of this 40-year economic experiment, the article points out a really stark contrast. For the first half of the proposition, it totally worked. Capital flourished, markets absolutely expanded, and high earners saw massive benefits from those sustained tax reductions. The wealth definitely accumulated at the top. But the second half of the equation, that trickle-down effect and the equitable diffusion of that wealth, well, it persistently underperformed. The money simply didn't flow downward the way it was originally projected to.
So instead of equitable prosperity, the author notes we're left with 3 pretty stark realities today. Drastically widened income inequality across advanced economies, stagnant social mobility, and severely hollowed out public services. The equation has essentially become deeply unbalanced over the last 40 years. We've ended up with a society where the gap between the top and the bottom keeps growing, while the actual resources meant to support the general public are steadily diminishing.
Section 4, the tax policy paradox. Despite those incredibly uneven results, the ideology is still heavily enduring today. And Akibe argues that it is primarily driven by how we handle tax policy. You see, modern tax codes have introduced incredibly complex layers. Those with means have access to sophisticated financial advice and legal structuring, which allows them to significantly reduce or sometimes entirely escape the math of taxation. Meanwhile, your average taxpayer operates with a very, very narrow band of flexibility. They're effectively left underwriting the entire system straight from their own paychecks.
And boom, that creates what Akibe calls a massive structural contradiction. Politicians constantly promise lower taxation while miraculously claiming they can maintain or even expand public services. Just think about that for a second. The inputs go down, but the outputs supposedly stay exactly the same. How on earth does that work? The author emphasizes that this isn't just a political preference. It's a fundamental contradiction of basic arithmetic. You literally cannot spend money you no longer have. Section 5. The mathematical impossibility. This brings us to the harsh reality of the overarching argument here. Government finance is absolutely not immune to math.
Remember that inputs and outputs ledger from earlier? If revenue declines without expenditure dropping, that gap doesn't just magically disappear into thin air. Akige outlines that it gets filled by one of three pretty grim options. Option 1, borrowing, which basically just shifts the burden to the future. Option 2, austerity, which means making deep, painful cuts. Or option 3, the sheer degradation of public goods. There is no hidden fourth option born out of ideological optimism. The bill always comes due.
Akube hits the nail on the head with this quote. The claim that a state can simultaneously shrink its revenue base and maintain its obligations is not innovative thinking. It is a mathematical impossibility. Plus, the author notes that presenting this impossible math to the public isn't just misleading, it practically borders on a complete breach of public trust.
The main takeaway here is actually beautifully simple. Governance, at the end of the day, is just resource allocation under constraint. You can absolutely advocate for a smaller state, or you can advocate for a larger one. But you cannot, without veering entirely into fiction, argue for both lower inputs and unchanged outputs. You just can't cheat the fundamental equation.
If a government genuinely wants to shrink the inputs and have the state retreat, Akube demands they actually be honest about it. They have to explicitly admit that they're rewriting the social contract. And it means accepting this stark new reality, that we would no longer be citizens participating in a shared system of mutual provision. Instead, we just become mere consumers, shopping around in a fragmented marketplace for essential services like security, healthcare, and education. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, really provocative thought to chew on. Based on the cold, hard arithmetic of governance we've explored today, which side of this equation do you actually want to live in? Do we want a shared system of mutual provision or a fragmented marketplace of essential services? Because the math says we definitely can't have both. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the math behind the promises.